Hello and welcome to the channel, where today we're going to have a look at the poster boys. Because the Ultramarines and their successors have been doing some really great work in the competitive scene, even in the competitive 9th edition meta. And the reason for that is because they have some really interesting plays. So if you're new to this channel, we don't go through every single rule in the book and every single datasheet. What this video is designed to do is to give you the key plays and gotchas that your opponents might have that you need to know if you're not an Ultramarines player. So let's dive in. So let's start off then with the chapter tactics for the Ultramarines. So they get +1 to their leadership, which is always nice, and they can also fall back and shoot at a -1 to hit. Now this is always going to be really useful, especially if the player has dreadnoughts, for example, because you don't want to be forced to shoot a particular unit. It's also worth noting though that there is a stratagem to allow any Ultramarines unit, even if it is a successor unit, to fall back and shoot and charge, and this means that it's going to be really hard to tie down the Sons of Guilliman. The Super Doctrine, which takes place for the Ultramarines in the Tactical Doctrine, so that's turns 2 and turn 3, means that Ultramarines units count as standing still for the purposes of shooting if they didn't advance or fall back. Now this is going to be a big deal in terms of heavy weapons, so they can move and shoot their heavy weapons without the -1 to hit, and of course it also means they get access to bolter discipline even if they've moved. And it's also worth bearing in mind that the Ultramarines have multiple ways of manipulating doctrines, and so they're going to be able to get into this if they really want to in the other turns. Speaking of ways to manipulate doctrines, let's move on then to the Warlord traits. So they do have one to put a unit into the Tactical Doctrine. If it is not already, they have a 6-inch aura, which means that units can fall back and not suffer that -1 to hit when they're shooting. They also have one for 6 inches, allowing infantry and biker units to heroically intervene, which is always going to be really great against a combat army, and the character can take a 6-inch heroic intervention themselves. Moving on to Relics. So there aren't many 3-up invens in the game left now, but there are actually a few that are going to still sit with the Ultramarines, as we'll discover today. So the Sanctic Halo is a relic that they have, which gives them a 3-up inven, and they can deny the Witch once per turn. There are a couple of other relics that I've put on the screen, but I'm not going to go through them all. However, I did just want to talk about Seal of Oath. Now this gives a 6-inch aura, giving full rerolls to hit and to wound against one target. So if you've got a big blob of Terminators, for example, you might want to combat squad them, and if you've got Knights, really good luck, try and protect the Knight that they're going to use that against. The Ultramarine psychic powers are not particularly interesting, so I'm not going to go through them all now, because I think the core Space Marine ones are quite frankly just better, and so you're more likely to see those. However, they do have one to halve the move characteristic of a target and -1 to advance and charge, but generally speaking, as I say, I think if you're going to see Librarians for the Ultramarines, you're probably going to see those core Space Marine powers, Null Zone, Psychic Fortress, etc. And so let's move on then to the units of the Ultramarines, because they actually have a whole bunch of characters. Let's start off with the big one then. Bobby G, of course, he is a big deal. So not only is he really good in combat himself, because he has the Emperor's Sword, he can do mortal wounds, he's actually really tough to kill. He's a screenable character, and he's got a 3-up inven, and he's able to get back up after he is killed on a 4-up. This can't be re-rolled anymore, but you do really need a plan if you're going to go against Guilliman, and be prepared to lose whatever unit it is that you kill him with the first time. Okay, he does actually give some pretty good buffs to any units he's with, so he can give +1 to advance and charge to Imperium units, for example, and he allows core and character units within 6 to re-roll hits and 1s to wound. Marnie is Calgar. He does half the damage, so he is quite tough to shift, but he's not nearly as dangerous as Big Bobby G himself. And then Chief Librarian Tigurius is actually a pretty tasty option for the Ultramarines, so he can re-roll any psychic test that he takes, and he gets +1 to psychic and deny the witch tests. So he's a very reliable psyker, and he has an ability to make one unit -1 to hit each battle round. So your opponent can stick him next to a dreadnought, for example, and make him a bit tougher to shift. So there are just a few other characters that I wanted to mention quickly. So we have Chaplain Cassius, who can allow models nearby to deal wounds back if they're killed in melee. We have Cato Sicarius, who can grant objectives secured to a unit nearby. And then of course we have the new Yuri or Ventress model. So he is a captain that can use the adaptive strategy stratagem for 1 less CP than normal. This is the stratagem from the core Space Marines rulebook, which means that they can count all doctrines as being active for one specific Space Marine unit. Then the final character I just wanted to mention was Sergeant Kronos, and he can essentially be embarked on a bunch of Space Marine tanks and they will get +1 to their ballistic skill, and he can heal them from within. And that's it for the characters to go through for the Ultramarines, but there's just a few other units to mention. So we have our final 3-up invuln on the Victrix Honor Guard, and these essentially will act as bodyguards for other characters. They have that ability where they can stop ranged attacks from targeting characters within 3 inches of them, and they can heroically intervene, so do watch out for them. And then we have Honor Guard, which are kind of like a lesser version of the Victrix Honor Guard, and we have Tyrannic Veterans. Of course, it's a very niche thing, but if you are a Tyranids player, then this could be something to give you trouble, so you know, keep an eye out for that one. And then of course the Ultramarines have a bunch of stratagems that they have access to. Now I'm not actually going to go through that many now, because quite frankly a lot of them are not that interesting and they're certainly not going to take you by surprise, but there are some I just wanted to mention. So the biggest one being rapid redeployment. This is basically a redeploy for 3 units. It's always really good, and it's one of the best tricks that the Ultramarines have right now. But there's a few others that I'll just mention. So they can hit with any single attack, they can reroll hits and wounds and combat against word bearers, and they have a stratagem for 2 CP to overwatch with 3 friendly Ultramarines units within 6 inches of the unit that you're charging. So be really mindful of charging big Ultramarines castles and trying to pick things off and charge things that aren't going to be within 6 inches of other units. And that is it for this Ultramarines gotcha guide. So please do check out the Space Marines video, because of course the Ultramarines have access to everything inside of that as well. Please do like and subscribe.